Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, as I've said already, for the non-binary webinar. I'm Sarah Turkington and I work at Ayrshire College, and I'm delighted to be joined by Vic Valentine, who is from the SDA. Just a couple of things before we get started. This afternoon really is going to be a webinar that's much more based on having a kind of conversation, a dialogue. And for that perspective, that we would hope that for those who are participating today, that you will have all of your questions, if any, and you will have them much later on, and you will type into the chat, and then from there we will begin to address your questions. That's the hope anyway. Just to say as well, the webinar today is an hour long. We are hoping that it will last as long as that, and I'm hoping again that there'll be plenty of questions on the go. Particularly just want to draw our attention to the fact that we are, for the first time, broadcasting on both platforms, one being CDN and the other being Glow. So just to make you aware of that. The reason being that Glow is part of this, as well as it's hugely important to us as a college, as well as me personally, that our schools are involved in any trans inclusion. So part of the dialogue really is about making it better for all. Just to say as well, again, personally, I'm very pleased to see how many participants there are this afternoon in this webinar. It's really encouraging to see that there's people who are taking gender and the impact of it very seriously in terms of educational experience and educational success. As I've said already, we are joined by Vic, and our approach really one is going to be based on dialogue and conversation. So from that perspective, I'm hoping that, again, we'll have questions later on, but in the meantime, we'll just give a bit of a grounding to first of all, what non-binary is, leading on to a kind of relevancy. And that's where we'll kind of centre some of the discussion, as well as then being taken in terms of your own. I hope everybody can hear me at this point okay.
Good.
That's good to know, because I've probably just babbled for a little bit there, but as I said, hopefully we can get properly started now. As I said already, it's hugely encouraging to see this amount of people involved in this particular webinar, and again, I think the significance of that, and hopefully will be seen within the educational establishments that we ourselves work in. So just to kind of move on, if I just kind of press this.
Can you hear us now? Yeah, we all back. Excellent.
Good. We just need to flick that one as well. See the top. Okay, and just to kind of say, can everybody hear us and see us?
Yes.
Okay, apologies about that. We seem to have lost our connection on both Glow and CDN, but we appear to be back on both, and I'm glad that you've stuck with us. Just before we kind of cut off, one of the key things we began to talk about was the definition of non-binary. Because we did cut off, I'm hoping Vic's just going to go through that again. So thinking about non-binary in terms of defining it, how would we define it? How would we be able to identify?
Yeah, so I was just saying it's an umbrella term for anyone who doesn't identify as a man or a woman. A good way to think of it is that in Western society, we have something called the gender binary, which is our dominant way of understanding gender, and that is that everyone will be a man or a woman, and that these two genders are kind of opposite and complementary in some way. So the reason the word non-binary is used is because it's any identity that doesn't fit in with that dominant idea, that those are the only two ways a person can be.
So you think that then suggests that gender is actually more a kind of a spectrum, that there's more than just male and female?
Yeah, absolutely. Some people who are non-binary would consider themselves to be in some way a combination of male or female, but lots of people say that neither of those words are relevant to them. They don't see themselves in between, they don't see themselves as more one or the other. It's how they feel about themselves isn't described by those words. And also some non-binary people don't identify as having a gender identity. And for them, again, sort of those kinds of terms, those kinds of feelings just don't make sense to their sense of themselves.
Okay. So when it comes to gender identity, how might a person who identifies as being non-binary actually present themselves?
Well, when it comes to identities, there are lots of different terms that people use. We did a survey recently, and the most common term people used after non-binary itself was genderqueer, which is another kind of lots of terms to do with non-binary identities are very new and they're very personal to each person, so they're quite hard to pin a kind of a genderqueer person identifies in this way. It's more that there are lots of new words that people use that just kind of break them out of that box of simply I am a man or I am a woman. Um, as I said, some people don't feel like they have a sense of a gender identity at all, and the most common way people describe that is as being agender. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of similar to how people would say they were asexual, but rather than being about sexual orientation, it's about gender identity. And then gender fluid is another one that's quite a common way for people to describe themselves if they feel that their sense of who they are isn't fixed but changes.
Okay. Again, some of the things that Vic was saying there in terms of terminology really got me thinking, because you mentioned gender fluid, gender queer.
Yeah.
So therefore, does that suggest that non-binary is inclusive of those terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So non-binary is kind of the umbrella term. It's everything for which man or woman wouldn't adequately describe that sense of who you are. But the diversity underneath that is actually really huge. So what it means for two people to be non-binary can be entirely different. All it means is that both of them definitely don't just feel like a man or just like a woman.
Okay, so it's a unique experience, but it falls under the umbrella of trans.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the key thing again for us, and that's why many, I don't know if I can speak properly, why some of you have joined us is in regards to thinking about trans inclusion within our own educational contexts. So thinking about the relevancy then, how important is it to use the correct pronouns or language as a total when it comes to working with not only non-binary students, but our own staff?
I think it's really important because an understanding of language is one of the most obvious and clear ways you can let someone know that you respect who they are and how they feel about themselves. And also because it's a very kind of small adjustment to make on the parts of kind of institutions and colleagues and teachers, but actually the effect that has on an individual can be really, really great. So as you mentioned, pronouns are really important. So lots of non-binary people prefer to use sort of non-gendered pronouns. So I use the singular plural pronoun they, which is gender neutral, which sometimes people think is a bit hard to get to grips with. But actually you use it all the time without realizing. If you say you are on a bus and you notice there's a jacket on the seat behind you but no person there, you would just say, oh, someone's left their jacket, we should hand it into the bus driver. So it's not actually that unusual a thing to do. You do use it all the time when you don't know what gender someone is. It's just that it can feel slightly sort of new and strange when you're using it about a known person.
Okay. And then how do you think we can build people's confidence to use things like they or them? You know, because I'm kind of thinking some people might find that difficult because we are in that kind of binary of male or female. So is there any suggestions or?
I think just being reassured of the importance of it, because it's I mean, it definitely is something that comes with practice, because sometimes we say to people, oh, if you're struggling a little bit, try just to use the person's name. If it's not coming naturally to you to use that pronoun, maybe try and use the person's name. But actually in the long run, that sort of also creates this barrier where it seems like this person's pronoun is too difficult to use, so we'll have to use their name, but we won't have to use other people's name in that way. So and I think, yeah, just thinking of examples like that, the kinds of things where you do definitely already use they as a pronoun and just applying it more generally, or sometimes just imagine you're talking about a group of people, even though it sounds really bizarre, just to get to grips with it. And it becomes really, really natural as well once you're used to it. I mean, unsurprisingly, I now have many friends who use neutral pronouns, and you just sort of, half the time I accidentally use neutral pronouns for everybody.
Yeah, it's just part of your chat, I guess.
Yeah, and now I always use neutral pronouns for people who I don't know how they identify, even if they have a name that might seem to indicate to me a gender. I would just stick with neutral pronouns till I'd actually met that person and had established what pronouns they used.
I think that's a really important point. It's something that's so obvious that perhaps we don't always consider or think of as being important, that kind of gender neutralness of who that person is. Again, embedded within that, you said about pronouns, they, them. If we go a wee bit further then, and you identified yourself as being a non-binary person, what about title, for example? What would that be, or
So
if anything?
the title that I use on things like my bank card and my driving license is MX. That's how it's written. You can pronounce it either mix or mux.
MX.
It's being, as I said, it's being offered now by an increasing range of places. So yeah, you can have it printed on a driver's license, and all the banks will print it on your debit cards for you now. And more kind of online spaces are letting you, your drop-down menu now includes that as well. But I think that's a really good thing that can be done to show that kind of places are welcoming of non-binary people, because often, especially if you're looking at online application forms, you can't get past that first screen without selecting your title. And if the only options are ones that are traditionally gendered, it kind of instantly puts you in a position where you have to make a choice that's neither of them are going to be particularly helpful to you. So just that little adding in of that one extra field instantly flicks something in someone's head that says, oh, these people know about gender neutral titles. This is probably the kind of place that's more inclusive of me.
And again, I think that has a clear relevancy to an educational context, both for students and staff. So as a staff member, for example, even having that opportunity to have other than a Mr. or Mrs. or whatever, a title reference. And again, as you've kind of said, that would suggest that an organisation is inclusive. And I guess ultimately that's what all of us, or I hope all of us, are striving to. So thinking a wee bit further then, what are the other things that you think would make a difference to a non-binary person or a trans person within a context like this?
Well, I think that lots of the things you can do to make places more inclusive of non-binary people, a particularly great thing about it is that they also make places so much more inclusive for everyone, because not only for binary trans students, but even just for students day to day, because what they tend to do is break down gendered expectations. So a big thing to do, we did a survey recently with non-binary people, and one of the big problems they told us about was the kind of unnecessary way that language was often gendered. So in terms of in information leaflets that they read on kind of the websites they visit for things. So, for example, using terminology like both genders rather than all genders, saying things are open to men and women or boys and girls rather than saying things are open to everyone, really kind of, I think, the sorts of things that are done completely unthinkingly.
And not deliberate, and most times not deliberately.
Entirely undeliberate. I mean, nobody in their head is thinking, I don't want non-binary people to participate, so I will say this is open to men and women. In their heads, by saying that, they're saying it's open to everyone, but actually by going that step further and having in the back of your mind, hang on, if I actually specify these two genders, I am leaving some people out, then that can kind of, again, not using that sort of language gives a really strong statement to people that they are included. Other types of language people give as examples of is sort of saying mothers and fathers rather than parents, really kind of the sorts of things you really, really don't think about, but there's often a way to say exactly what you mean to without sort of attaching a male and female gender to the terms you're using.
And again, even just when you said their mother and father, it kind of made me think, oh, I probably myself would do that. And in particular, it made me think about, even in questions or in a normal kind of conversation you might have with someone, or even in terms of educational resources that we have. So within a subject, for example, a book could be mother and father. But I guess it's moving that conversation on, I guess, and having a dialogue that it's maybe more than mother, father, male, female.
Absolutely. And it's not to sort of say that you need to eradicate these sorts of attachments to gender all of the time. If you know someone has a sibling, you know their sibling is a girl, you know their sibling is their sister, that's fine. Talk to that person about their sister. Absolutely. You don't need to keep saying sibling, but when asking people if they have any siblings, that's what you should ask them rather than asking if they have any brothers and sisters. So it's just leaving that space at the beginning for kind of everyone to be included and anyone to define themselves as they want to within those kinds of questions.
And you mentioned also a survey that you had recently been involved in and done. And what kind of things were coming from that in terms of how people were feeling?
A lot of, so it was quite a big survey. We spoke to 895 people in the end.
And was this, sorry, Vic?
It ran between July and September, pretty much all done online. And it was UK-wide, although about a third of our respondents were from Scotland, so about 300 of the 900. And a big thing that people said was basically a sense of invisibility. Whenever they were accessing services, just feeling like nobody knew that non-binary genders existed. And even when they might encounter people who were open and would listen, there was a sense that people were often having to educate people. So they would be going somewhere for support, and often what would end up happening is they would be walking people who were supposed to be supporting them through what their identity meant and how to use pronouns and all these kinds of things, and it became much more work on the sort of behalf of the non-binary person than there maybe should have been in what it was they were after. So that was definitely the biggest thing, that sense of just sheer invisibility. And another really big thing people were talking to us about that's so easy to correct is just how much they weren't able to fill in forms accurately. It's just so silly and so unnecessary, but almost the first thing you're asked on every single form is, are you a man or a woman? On almost every form for anything you'll ever do. And it's just that very first kind of, your sort of heart sinks a little bit, and it's like, oh, like, again, which one should I pick today? Because if you can't answer accurately, you sort of wonder, what's the point in answering at all? Why are they asking me? Do I want to engage in this service? Do I want to go to this college? All that kind of thing. And
that's a really interesting point, an important one. Do I want to go to this college? If these are the types of things that have been asked of me as well. And it's how then we would, as a college or schools as well, would try and address that at that moment, but also, again, the message that we would be sending out. In terms of forms, so that's a particularly important aspect.
And it's just so easy to change, because it is almost always the first thing someone will see when they engage with anything. They'll be asked for their title, they'll be asked for what gender they identify as. And if they see instantly that they've got the option of gender neutral titles or to not put a title, and they've got the option to define themselves in a way that isn't just as a man or a woman, going to instantly be put at ease, because it doesn't happen in enough places yet. And it definitely is something that I think really means a lot to people, because it's quite sparse at the minute.
I think maybe that's also about that individual feeling as though they're valued and being recognised as who they are. And again, in terms of inclusion, that's particularly important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just thinking about how things are currently, you had written a kind of comment piece in terms of the Equality Act and particular attention to gender reassignment. So can you just tell us a wee bit about what the piece was that you had written, as well as what is undergoing or what's happening currently?
Yeah, so basically at the UK Parliament there was an inquiry into transgender equality. And they heard lots of evidence, and they've produced kind of a big report with recommendations that's aimed at the Westminster government mainly, but will obviously have impacts in Scotland on reserved matters, one of which is the Equality Act. At the minute, the way that trans people are protected in the Equality Act is, gender reassignment is the name of the protected characteristic, and the legislation specifically makes reference to transsexual people. And what the inquiry report recommended was that this was all changed so that the protected characteristic would now be gender identity, and that would include gender expression, and that the word transsexual was changed to transgender. So if that were to come into effect, we would see a much broader range of trans people covered by equality law than is now. And we would also see people who aren't trans covered, because if it includes gender expression, it would also cover those people who may identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, but just happen to be gender non-conforming in the way they express themselves. So hopefully that's something that will go forward.
So on the whole, then you would see it as a positive thing, because it's going to include identities that are currently missing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like non-binary.
Because some non-binary identities would be included under the current legislation because of the way it's worded, but it's quite difficult to know exactly who would be covered in exactly what circumstances the way it's written now. But if they were to be expanded in the way they've recommended, then it would be incredibly clear that anybody basically who expresses their gender in a way that society might find slightly different to the norm is definitely covered from discrimination. So that's obviously a really positive thing.
So at the moment, though, like as institutions, we've got to do the work to make it more inclusive of trans people and non-binary within that.
Yeah.
And we've kind of talked about some of the things that can be done to do that. Again, in terms of relevancy, I said earlier on about educational experience and educational success. So are we seeing much in terms or in the way of non-binary identities, young people, in terms of their educational experience? Are they performing, for example, on par with other genders?
Well, at the minute, we just don't know, really, because...
No way to record it, I guess.
Exactly, because nowhere is asking you if you're anything other than a man or a woman. So there's not really any kind of good high-level data on what the differences might be, which is why it would be brilliant if places started properly asking people about their gender, because then you can see, are certain people, who identify outside of the binary not performing as well? Are there problems in terms of the support in place? And that would be a really brilliant step forward. But yeah, at the minute, basically couldn't tell you because nobody's collecting any information on it.
That's, again, support is particularly important, and important to, again, all of the institutions and places that are taking part in the webinar this afternoon. But just even thinking further about that, if it's not immediately seen as being inclusive, then is it likely someone's going to come forward for support? And I think these are things that each of us would have to consider as well, of how we would then go about doing that.
Yep.
So just taking it a wee bit forward, we're going to open up in terms of questions. So if anybody would like to start to forward some questions, then we could take it from there. If everybody can still hear us. In the meantime, since the questions are coming through, there's one. We'll just take the first one that's come through, and I'll direct that towards Vic. What kind of support do you think needs to be in place in colleges?
Well, I think that just generally for trans students, not even just non-binary students, what's really useful is just knowing that the college is aware that trans and non-binary people exist, that they have good policies in place, that they display materials that clearly show trans people sort of living their lives, that everything is kind of, that trans becomes a bit more mainstream, and it's not so much always a kind of, like a tag along kind of special interest thing to be taught about or thought about every now and then, but actually, of course, trans people come to our college, trans people work at our college. But
I think those two things are very important, that who our staff are then reflect who our students are and vice versa. But it's then about making that organisation visible, that it actually has people who are non-binary, trans, lesbian, gay, bi, and all others that go with that.
Yeah, definitely. I think visible role models in the staff team, where possible, is a really great and powerful thing for young people, particularly because lots of young trans people may never have met another trans person before. So seeing a member of staff who they trust and who's sort of in a position of authority in a place where they might spend the majority of their time can have a really positive impact. I also think that where possible, kind of emotional/peer support can be really useful if it's something that's able to be provided by the college, because at the minute healthcare provision for trans people isn't great.
So, what do you mean by that, sorry?
Well, just because there are very long waiting times, particularly, and mental health support generally is just really not great at the sort of young person level. There's just not enough support to go around. So any way that can kind of be bulked up within the education setting is kind of brilliant, because again, it's where young people often spend the vast majority of their time. So if it's something they can access in their regular day, then...
I think even again, having that openness to discuss support when it comes to mental health, particularly of what support then could be accessed within a college or within a school, and particularly thinking about, say, for example, inclusive learning or student services, just flagging that up, that student is there, and how then they can get support to that student. And that also is about how those different parts of the college would speak to each other, I think. Because ultimately as well, as I said earlier about educational experience and educational success, if we want students to be here in the first place and then to pass and to be successful, then we need different parts to talk to each other within the college.
Yeah. And I think knowledge and awareness is really important, because a trans student, a non-binary student, they're not always going to need support in relation to their gender identity.
Mm-hmm.
But if they go and seek support, and when they come out as trans or are open about themselves, a member of staff looks sort of terrified by this revelation because they're unsure about the language or they're worried about making a mistake, then that can obviously put up an instant barrier. And I think non-binary stuff is kind of behind the understandings of like trans men and women, and
that in itself, we still have a long way to go.
And it's much further behind, obviously, now the understandings of sort of cisgender, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people.
Mm-hmm.
And it is just about kind of breaking down that almost like mystique about it, so that actually when staff are encountering trans students, when staff are meeting trans colleagues, there's not sort of panic first, deal with later. Mm-hmm. It can just be taken in your stride, mm-hmm. because it isn't always the reason somebody needs help or support. And it's really important, I think, that everyone has at least a kind of basic mm-hmm. understanding and knowledge of kind of what it is. Yeah. And
so training in itself is an important support mechanism.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, for staff mm-hmm. as well.
Absolutely.
Looking back at some of the questions there. Is there any more questions that we could answer? I'm just thinking the one that's there, Vic.
What would you suggest as a good phrase for asking? A good phrase for asking what? Person who asked that question? Liz Richardson?
Binary, non-binary.
I'm still not sure I entirely understand.
Can I, just while that's kind of coming through, just to pick up on that point there as well, that Anne-Marie said, I think the most important thing to find out how the student wishes to be supported. And I think that is certainly very important in terms of encouraging, again, that dialogue that we were speaking about.
Yeah,
so the student's part of it.
And also, again, I think it is, like I said, that's why training, I think, can really help, because it gets rid of that panic element and it makes you realise that that's the approach you would be wanting to take with anyone anyway. You want it to be person-centred, you want it to be individual-focused, you want to be looking at the whole student in front of you. So as soon as you have the confidence around trans stuff to not find that something that's getting in the way of focusing on the broader picture, mm-hmm. then it means mm-hmm. that all of the things you already have the skills to do, you can do.
Okay. So it's in terms of confidence, but also I think just understand that sometimes people will make a mistake, as long as it's not a deliberate mistake in mm-hmm. terms of titles, pronouns,
yep.
and others.
Yep.
So just again, looking back,
I think I understand now. So you mean if you were to ask on a monitoring form about, if you wanted to ask about people's gender identity on a monitoring form? Yeah. Well, what we would normally suggest the best thing to do would be to say, how would you describe your gender identity? And then you would have male, female, and then the third option would perhaps say in another way. And
or then, just other.
And then normally the kind of best practice thing we would suggest is to have a write-in box where if people wanted to, they could kind of let you know the specific term they might use for their gender identity, just kind of because it's nice sometimes to not just have to tick other. You might have one word that you feel particularly strongly, but yeah, that's kind of the best and easiest way to do it.
Is there any other questions?
And in terms of in asking in your applications, it could also, we also say where possible that it's really good if people could actually include a field that asks what people's pronouns are, because often, again, once you know someone's pronouns, you're not necessarily really going to need to grapple with the fact that they're a trans student. If someone's able to tick that form, tell you, I describe my gender in another way, I use the pronoun they come to college, you greet them using their name, you use the correct pronouns, that's kind of it all done and dusted. So if you are able to add that additional box, so, you know, name first, gender identity, what pronouns do you use, then move on to your other demographic questions, that's also another really great way of kind of skipping past any of the awkwardness. And also, again, that shows so strongly to all trans people that you have trans equality in mind if you're asking about pronouns, because often one of the biggest sort of fears trans people have is about being misgendered, and worrying, when should I correct people, when do I let people know? And if you remove that instantly by just having, you know, do you use the pronoun he, she, or they, or other, please let us know. And it just completely removes that.
Funnily enough, just when you said that, someone's asked about barriers, and I've said, in your experience, what do you think are the main barriers faced by non-binary students?
I think
that in itself can be a barrier.
Yeah.
Barriers.
I think the main thing is probably a lack of awareness and understanding. That's definitely the thing that we got back over and over again from the survey. And people also told us that there's so little kind of inclusion in terms of visibility and discussion of non-binary identities that this can have really negative impacts on people. People were talking about feeling like their identities were less valid, having poorer self-esteem, poorer mental health, all of the, you know, being less likely to use services because they don't want to encounter this lack of visibility. So it does have kind of real definite negative impacts on people's lives. And I think that's the main thing, the concern that who do I tell? Because if I tell someone, will they even know what I'm talking about? I think is the main barrier. It's sort of that additional thing of not just do I come out, it's is someone just going to shrug their shoulders at me and say, what? So I think, a sort
that in itself could then act as a barrier.
Absolutely. And I think that's how making really little changes in the way you talk about things to make it, because although to a person who identifies in a binary way, the idea of changing between both genders and all genders probably sounds a bit kind of pedantic. I can pretty much guarantee that any single non-binary person in a room, if they hear someone use the phrase all genders, that will instantly ping for them that that person is talking in an inclusive way and that person knows about non-binary identities. So it can make a really big difference, little changes.
That again comes back onto what you said earlier, as well as how you would greet people, as well as how you would maybe greet a class, men, women, guys, girls, and language like that. So just kind of trying to not correct yourself, but thinking about there's more than just male and female.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that answers your question about barriers. Just looking a wee bit further, are there any other titles apart from the MX?
Yeah, there are a few. That is the absolute most popularly used one by miles. It's also the only one I know of that's gender neutral, that is kind of widely available on things, that isn't obviously something like doctor that's related to a profession in some way. But people use lots. Some of the other ones I've heard of is per for like person, IND for individual. I mean, because actually it's lots of young people are kind of identifying and organising as non-binary communities online. Language around this stuff is really creative and changing all the time. So we have to catch up.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So when we did the survey, I think it was a huge. I think more than 90% of people said they used MX, and then the next preferred thing was to not use a title. So that was almost half. And then everything else was a very, very small number of people who said that they would use other ones. So there are other gender neutral titles. So if you come across someone sort of taking it in their own hands to fill something in with a title you've never heard of, it's very likely that it's because it's a gender neutral one. But yeah, I mean, there are actually tons of them swimming about.
Is there any written advice or guidance how we can or we could access? My memory is not as good as it used to be. That's a shame, Suzanne. So is there any written advice or guidance? Which just reminds me actually about the SQA and what they've recently said.
Plug my own work.
That's why you're here.
We finished the survey in September and we're writing up the report of all the findings, but there's also going to be a much kind of shorter, basically top tips piece of guidance done on it that will be available on the Scottish Transgender Alliance website, and we'll also be getting some printed, so if people wanted to like order copies, they'd also be able to do that, and that will be a sort of A5 booklet that's about 20 pages long, that will have kind of very easy, very followable top tips on what to do. Basically all the stuff I've been talking about. Think about asking about pronouns on forms, think about getting rid of binary language, think about gender neutral facilities, all those kinds of quite easy to follow, sort of sometimes easily missed opportunities to be more inclusive. So at the minute, nothing that I know of written wise specifically exists for non-binary stuff. But hopefully that will be out within the next couple of months. So keep an eye on our website.
Well, you said about guidance and how that's going to come through yourselves, but you mentioned policy earlier as well. So maybe that's where our organisations could kind of be in contact with yourselves and make sure that we are having either a trans policy or at least it's explicit in policies that we already have. Yeah,
I think it's really important to make sure that
and that again applies to both staff and students.
Yeah, to make sure that trans is named, and to make sure that when you name trans as something that you are sort of thinking about in your equality and diversity policies, that you're defining trans in a way that's clearly inclusive of all trans people, not just trans men and trans women. Because particularly for staff recruitment, I think things like equality and diversity policies is going to be one of the first places a potential trans member of staff is going to look to see, does this college, does this school seem like they're sort of on track with these kinds of things or not.
And again, that just goes back to what message and what positive message that you're sending out as an organisation. So even social media could be a part of that. Your website, what you project on there, what's included in there.
Absolutely.
And again, just thinking about the SQA, do you want to fill in a wee bit in terms of what's currently happening? I think currently at the moment in terms of the SQA, male and female are the only options. And they are looking to have other options.
They've just redone their trans guidance, so it's impossible to say what the time frame might be for them to include other gender options. But what they have made very clear now is that students' candidate numbers will always stay the same if you're changing their name or their gender on their record. So just to know that you don't need to panic that someone's going to sort of lose all their examination history if you change any of that over. And the guidance is actually very good because it's quite hands-off in the sense of that it says that the individual school or college, it's up to them what evidence they might ask for to make this change, and the SQA doesn't request to see any of that. So our suggestion would be basically sort of a signed letter from the student saying, this is the new name I want to use on my exam certificates, this is the gender I'd like to have recorded on it, would be entirely fine and suitable. In that sense, I think it's very easy to change over on their system.
It seems to be the SQA are basically saying it's to the discretion of the centre or the school of how they would then...
they're not interested in sort of checking up on any evidence you've seen or anything.
And again, I say discretion because I think that's particularly important within a school or within a college of what we're then asking, because evidence in itself can seem a bit of a scary word, and something like a letter perhaps would be sufficient, or even it'd be up to yourselves, but maybe a discussion with that student as well, just thinking about what kind of support we can offer them. It needs to be a bigger conversation than just you want to change your gender or you want to change your name. The SQA were really helpful. That's good. We're just developing. Susan, who works at Edinburgh College, is saying here that she's developing a change of name and gender process. Happy to share, which is really good, because again, certainly in terms of how I feel, one of the reasons that we're doing this is to have an impact upon the sector, that all of us, it's not just about Ayrshire College or another college, it's about how we can work together to make the experience a better one. So thank you.
And I think sharing best practice can be super useful, because in our experience, what we hear from young people is that education settings is probably where there's the biggest sort of disparity in the types of experiences people are having. There are some examples of brilliant, inclusive environments with great good practice where young people feel really supported, really able to be out. And then there are also obviously examples where schools just haven't taken the time to think about implementing these things in advance of having a trans kid come out. and then things haven't gone so well for them. And I think ideally, obviously, what the STA would love to see is that stops being the case, that things are patchy and it depends on where you're going to school, where you're going to college, whether or not you have a good experience or not. We want it to be Scotland-wide, that everybody is having a great experience and that their gender identity isn't a part of that.
And again, even just thinking about that across Scotland, and in terms of having both GLOW and CDN as part of this, is seeing how both the college sector and the school sector can work together to make that experience, as I said already, a better one. Sorry, I've missed some of this. So, Anne-Marie, Caroline. On advice for students support each other.
I mean, I think.
Well, I was going to say, you had mentioned earlier about peer-to-peer support.
I think that can be super useful, and lots of schools and colleges already have sort of peer mentoring style programs in place.
And if not, like something that's happened here most recently is having LGBT plus student forums, which I think has been really proactive in the sense that it's trying to, it's led by students and it's trying to encourage other students to come along, and they don't have to identify as being an LGBT plus person. And I think that is also particularly important in raising awareness, educating and breaking barriers down in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's a particularly good way to approach it as well with young people, because actually it's so much easier to learn about all this stuff when you're younger, rather than to sort of end up realizing at however old that suddenly you need to unlearn lots of things that you've been taught all the way through. So yeah, I think that's a really great way to do it, to have them be more kind of open to all students, but for there to be a focus on that kind of peer support element where possible.
One of the other things that we have done here within the college is we've also gone into classes and run kind of inputs or workshops. But again, as was mentioned earlier, it's about really making sure the student, if there is a student within that class who is identifying as non-binary or the wider aspect of trans, feels okay with that, because you don't want to direct that it's about them, and actually equality is about everybody, and everybody's behaviour has got a role to play in actually creating equality.
Yeah, and also I think it's really important to think about trying to do these things proactively, so that you're not firefighting and it's not a student's come out,
do something.
We've had that policy on the shelf for 3 months. We should probably put this into practice now because it's going to start being relevant. We had talked about gender neutral toilets, but we sort of stopped thinking about it. I guess we better start thinking about it again, because it is much better to, you will be working with trans young people every day, and many of you may have worked with trans colleagues without ever knowing it. And it's much, much better to approach kind of all types of inclusion from that proactive perspective, rather than when adjustments become obvious, when the need for adjustments becomes obvious, to actually make those adjustments in advance of that becoming the case.
Like one of the things that we've been doing this week, funnily enough, is working with a colleague of Vic, Oceana, and she's been doing trans Q&As, and it's in a very public kind of forum. And there's kind of pros and cons of that as well, but at least the visibility is there. So indirectly, it can potentially have an impact upon a student or a staff member, again, in saying this college is inclusive and trans inclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if someone's too afraid to go up and have that conversation themselves, they can see that other people are doing that. That those are the kinds of speakers you're interested in inviting along. I think that's really, really powerful.
And we're doing it as part of marking LGBT, or we would see it as LGBT plus History Month. But I think what's really important is those kind of initiatives or activities go throughout a year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well. Just looking at some of the other questions that have come forward, what is your advice about gender neutral toilets?
That they're great, and that everyone should definitely have them if you're able to. I think in particular, because also lots of binary trans people tell us that the toilets can be quite nerve-wracking places. Although it is really important to stress that gender neutral toilets should never become trans toilets. They should never become the place that all trans kids have to go, and all the kids who aren't trans still just keep using the normal men's and women's toilets. But I think it's just really good to normalise this kind of thing, particularly because again it's just a social norm. It's not actually sort of necessary for all these facilities to be separate. Like in Scandinavian countries, all toilets are gender neutral. When you have a party at your house, you don't ask your guest, you don't ask one set of guests to use the upstairs bathroom and one set to use the downstairs bathroom. Everyone's bathroom in their home is a gender neutral bathroom. But again, it's just such an obvious thing to a non-binary person, if there is a toilet that's gender neutral, that this space has been thought of as including them. And it's also good where possible. I mean, obviously,
that even comes down to the symbols on the door, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, because obviously, people don't have limitless budgets, but it is good if it's not necessarily just the accessible toilet as well that gets made into the gender neutral one. It is good if sort of, I don't know, maybe you're renovating one area of one block of your college that needs to be done up, and then you can just have 3 separate ones.
And there's a safety element there. I think that's particularly important. So one, you might not identify with either male or female, so where's your option?
Yep.
But in terms of how that student may feel themselves or staff member again.
Yep.
So that was a good question. We use our accessible toilets.
Well, there are definitely people can play around with the signs that they use for toilets, so they want to make it obvious that they're gender neutral. One thing we really suggest though is that you see lots that are kind of like the typical sort of woman stickman, man stickman, and then kind of half and half stickman, and we think they're a bit kind of gimmicky and actually not so great. What we would often actually advise is to literally have a picture of a toilet that says maybe just a text underneath it, all gender toilet, and that's it. Because then all you're doing, this is what is behind this door. It is for anyone of any gender. And that kind of, you don't need to do, because the whole idea is it's breaking down that idea of kind of men and women and things. So rather than sort of doing one stick man, the other stick man, and then half and half.
It might send the image as well that you don't know what you are.
Yeah.
Either.
So and also, yeah, it just sort of feels a bit gimmicky, I think. But yeah, that's what we normally like, just a symbol of a toilet, all gender toilet, and then stick that on the door.
How would that differ from a unisex toilet?
So they're not really different. It's just, I think, semantically now, when people talked about unisex toilets in the past, they probably just meant toilets that men or women could use. But it's just that idea that now we're thinking that it's toilets that everybody can use of all genders. So yeah, no, they're not different to unisex toilets. It's just that we don't tend to use that language anymore.
Yeah. And even using the language of all genders, gender neutral and so on are important. I quite like that question there. Is there a transgender and non-binary symbol? I don't know if that's in reference to the toilet, but
there is a transgender symbol, which I can sort of vaguely describe. It sort of looks like the
male and female
together. So it sort of looks like there's lots of spikes coming off in all directions. I don't think that there's like a non-binary symbol.
This is your chance.
I'm not very creative.
Yeah.
There's lots of flags that go, similar to like the rainbow flag and things. There are flags that go specifically with trans, with non-binary, that kind of thing. But I don't think that non-binary has a symbol as such. Well, I mean, I'm sure one exists on the internet, but there isn't one I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah. Vic's going to work on that.
I'm not going to work on it.
Is there any other questions? Again, I'm just looking at the time. So this would be a good opportunity to kind of get some last questions in. Gender fluid, but I guess you were kind of saying that maybe.
Yeah, so my understanding of non-binary, like I said, is like an umbrella term. So I would say that gender fluid is basically sort of, it's underneath that umbrella. Again, gender fluid isn't in and of itself a fixed thing. Not every single person who describes themselves as gender fluid feels the same way. But when we did this non-binary survey, one of the questions we asked was, would you describe your gender as constant and fixed, or fluid and changing, or are you unsure? And more than half of people said that they would describe it as fluid and changing. And then we went on to ask them sort of to describe what that meant to them. And for some people, that would mean a kind of change in how they felt about their gender identity. That could change several times over the course of a day. For some people, that would actually mean periods of a few months where they identified in one way, but then that started to not feel so good, so they would identify in another way, but it could last for longer. Some people told us that their sort of gender identity changed based on the sorts of things they were doing, the kinds of people they were around. So it again, it's sort of a really big diverse thing, but it basically just means anyone whose sense of who they are when it comes to their gender does not stay at one fixed point. Yeah.
And again, huge implications of that, I would think, within an educational context.
Yeah, of course.
In terms of how that person's then feeling and how they then respond.
Absolutely. And one way, if you have, I suppose, probably, I mean, in fact, no, if you have a colleague or if you have a student who does identify as gender fluid, and as part of that, because their identity might be quite different some of the time, say perhaps they use two names. So some of the time they'll use the word Dave, that use the name David, and sometimes they'll use the name, I don't know, Alex, because say they're a person whose identity sort of fluctuates somewhere between sort of masculine and then somewhere more sort of gender neutral. What you can do is, ask people at the start of the day, and then have both of their names down on the register, just cross one out each day, so you know which name you're using for that day. And the same with pronouns, just sort of, because if people identify in a way where they change their name and they change their pronoun in relation to how they feel, they expect to be asked about that. They don't expect you to be able to guess instantly each time how you should refer to them. So people are going to be comfortable with, how are we feeling today? What name would you like me to use for you today? That's totally fine. And in fact, it's going to be what people will want you to ask them. So
it's okay to ask questions ultimately as well.
Yeah, it's almost always okay to ask questions as long as you realise as they're coming out of your mouth they're not very obviously intrusive. But yeah, I would say normally it's good to ask questions. If you aren't sure, it's good to clarify, because this language is all very new and it's changing a lot of the time, and it really does mean different things for different people. So you don't need to be an expert on what each term means. You don't need to know what that means someone feels like about themselves. All you need to do is feel comfortable with sort of knowing, okay, well, this means that this student is non-binary. This means I should ask them what pronouns they would like me to use for them. This means I should ask them, oh, would you like me to start using a different name to the one you had on the register before? You don't need to be able to give them a sort of textbook definition of what genderqueer means. It's just sort of knowing to have those kinds of responses to it.
And again, one of the things we've funnily enough recently been talking about is empathy. And sometimes you don't need to be that gender or that sexual orientation to have empathy and understanding. And ultimately, what all of us want is someone to just listen and value who we are, no matter who we are. I think that's important as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, just in terms of time, is there one last question? Or any other comments? Whilst we're waiting for things to come through, can I just thank you all for participating today? And if it was missed in translation, just to say right at the start, I think it's very important that each of you have participated. And I think, again, that illustrates and demonstrates how serious we all are within both the FE sector and within the schooling sector, that we are taking gender and gender identity as...
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions that ping into their head slightly later, my email address is on the first slide that was up, so feel free to send me an email if there was something you meant to ask but didn't get around to asking.
Yeah. Thank you. Multiple attendees typing. I think, even having something like this is really important, just to keep pushing it and keep having dialogues about what we can do to support trans and so on.
Yeah.
So thank you for participating in the very first place. There you go, a few more sessions. Get Vic back. Yeah. Anything else you want to say?
No, I think I'm all done. Just, thank you everyone for taking part.
Where are you based? Edinburgh.
Yeah, the STA is based in Edinburgh, but I'm in Ayrshire today. So we do travel all over the place.
Yeah, you keep coming back here, actually. Hooray. No. Yeah.